I want to introduce Kathy Davies. She is the managing director of the Stanford Life Design Lab and the Life Design Studio lead. So in addition to her roles there, she has 15 years of experience developing electromechanical and software products and proudly holds 5 patents. She consults with Silicon Valley companies, teaches design thinking, as we'll find out today, conducts ethnographic research, and develops product strategies and concepts. If that were enough, she's already a Renaissance woman. She also is the co-creator of Designing Your Life for Women and a passionate advocate for design thinking as a methodology to empower social change. And so there's a lot there, Kathy, so welcome. Really excited
Thanks
to host you.
Thanks for having me. I should probably also add I'm the mother of 2 teenage daughters, so maybe that's even harder than all of those other things.
Yes, that might be the hardest thing on the bio, especially in these past few years. Yeah. Wow.
Thanks for having me, Pax.
It's great to have you. And I think because we have such a big audience, probably the place to start with just providing some context on design thinking. So I know it's at the core of your approach to a lot of the things you do, in particular, designing your career and designing the professional. So could you give us the 30,000-foot view of what design thinking is?
Yeah, absolutely. Design thinking at its core is a human-centered process for problem solving. So it's really about placing people first and thinking about how we can solve problems for them. And there's a set of 5 steps that people think of when they think of design thinking. The first one is empathize. Who are the people you're trying to serve? In the case of designing your own life and career, that might be yourself. Then there's define. What do you think is worth working on? Where do you want to focus your time and energy? I think a lot of times when people think of design thinking, they think of the third step, ideate, which is all about generating lots and lots of ideas, getting really divergent, getting ideas that you wouldn't normally have. And I want to say that ideation is awesome, but that define step really determines the kind of ideas that are available to you. So the define step is a key bit, and I think it's often overlooked. So empathize, define, ideate. Once you have a bunch of ideas, then you've got to try them out in the world. And we call that prototyping. How do you test them in a small way to figure out if there's a there, if you should invest more time, energy, and resources? And that testing step, that 5th step, is about taking what you've built back to the people that you're hoping to serve and figuring out, is this something that is onto the problems they were really curious about solving? Does this meet their needs? And so you might test something with yourself. Hey, how is this working for me? What do I notice? And all of these steps are really kind of a bumpy road. You can iterate and change step from one to the other. It's not linear at all. It's really a cycle of iteration, of building your way forward, if you will.
That's fascinating, and I thank you for the clear sort of 5-step breakdown. So I guess following on that, so when I think of design thinking, and it's in your bio as well, so I think of it as something that you're applying to developing a product. So I want to create a new type of software, a new electromechanical system. So can you tell us a little bit more about the Life Design Lab, which first of all sounds like probably the coolest lab on Stanford's campus, and then how that lab or how the lab was created and came to use design thinking to helping people think about their life and their career?
Yeah, absolutely. The Life Design Lab was actually founded in 2007. It was founded by our 2 lab founders, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, who went on to write the book, Designing Your Life, and then the book, Designing Your New Work Life. And these 2 guys got together and they were just really looking at what was going on with students. So as you think about that design thinking process I just mentioned, they were using design to design curriculum. And they were asking themselves, what's going on with students at that time? And what was going on was the same thing that's going on with students now. And in fact, a lot of you out there, probably mid-career professionals, folks who are thinking about, what do I want to be when I grow up? Or what do I want to grow into as I become the next me in the next phase of my career or life? And folks are really struggling with this question. At that time, students were really struggling, particularly in product design, because product design was a relatively new field. And many students were leaving school with this question of, well, how do I tell my story? How do I apply this to work that matters in the world? And so these 2 guys sat down to create a class using design thinking, because that's the structure that they were teaching in product design classes and would be very familiar to students, to work on personal and professional development. What would it look like to design your life and your career? And the uptick was immediate. Students were very excited to have these conversations. They weren't able to have these conversations in any other space. And the structured set of activities really gave them a process to engage with how do they become really more conscious and competent in designing their life and career. So that then started a tiny pilot class that became larger and larger. It was originally offered just to product design students. Then Harry Elam and some other folks from the vice provost's office came in and said, "Do you offer this more broadly?" So then it was offered to all students. And then the invitation was, well, what about designing your time at college? And so we set out to design a class called Designing Your Stanford that then helped students land at school and think about how they wanted to design their education for the 4 or 5 years that they would be here. So our suite of offerings has become Designing Your Stanford, Designing Your Life for juniors and seniors, and then Designing the Professional, which is for graduate students and now potentially mid-career professionals.
Yeah, and maybe just, you mentioned taking the structured approach to it, because I know, there was nothing like this when I went to college, right? It was like, you go to the career resources office and they can review your resume or something like that, or give you tips on applying. So could you, I think to some extent the value is self-evident, but could you build out, why is it so important to approach designing or thinking about your career and life in a structured way, or what feedback have you gotten?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think mainly that the benefit of having a structure is that you are held in some sort of a process. A lot of us have these sort of broad philosophical questions, but where to start is just not clear. And especially now when there's so much ambiguity. We've gone through 2 years of incredible change. The pandemic has been really challenging for many of us. Maybe we've lost jobs. Maybe our home situation has shifted. Maybe our financial situation has shifted. We're feeling lost and confused. And so having a process where we can locate ourselves, hey, what might be a logical next step? How could I start addressing some of these questions is really helpful. And the thing I like about design thinking in particular is it doesn't assume anything about where you are or what resources you have or what your situation is. It just meets you wherever you are. It invites you to empathize with yourself, to define things that matter to you in this moment. It invites you to come up with ideas that are applicable to your current situation and to try them out, given whatever resources you have. And what I like about this in the face of ambiguity is it's comforting, right? There's structure, enough structure that I know what I might do next, but it's not so confining that I feel like, oh man, I must be doing it wrong. So it invites all of us into the process.
So when the world around you is so chaotic and unstructured, it's useful to have a way of approaching it that is structured, and that in itself kind of gives you a way of organizing it. So I want to go a little bit off script. It's related to this next question we have planned, but we're getting a lot of these questions. Well, so what are some specific examples? So you laid out the 5 steps. I'm going to repeat them: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and then test. Could we maybe just walk through what might you do? So we have people here right now. Can you just give us an example? What might you be doing on that first step of empathize? If you're the audience. Yeah.
We in our classes really invite people to do some work to understand themselves. And so a core piece of that is assessing where you're at right now. And so we ask people to do some writing as designers. What are they looking for in work? And by that, I don't mean a job description. I mean, what's your philosophy of work? Why work at all? What's the purpose of work? What's the purpose of work for you as an individual, for you as playing a role in your community? What does money have to do with it? What does meaning have to do with it? What does personal growth have to do with it? So we invite folks to actually spend some time reflecting and writing down their thoughts. And typically that's about a half page to a page. We keep it pretty concise. Then we also ask folks to think about what's their view of life? What's their worldview, so to speak? And asking really big questions. Why are we on this planet? What are we doing here? What is the role of a higher power in your life and experience? What is the role of your personal narrative in your experience? What are the key guiding principles that you might think are important as you approach life? And then we look at those two things together to create a compass. Are they coherent with one another? Where do they clash? Where do they energize each other? And just that noticing and that empathize hexagon gives us a foundation to build from. And it also gives us a sense of, hey, if these two things are together going to potentially point us in some direction, how can we use it then in our decision making? How can we evaluate opportunities to notice, does this fit with who we are, what we believe, and what we think we want to do? And so it's a very helpful compass or strategy, I think, to start with and to start understanding ourselves. We also spend some time thinking about our own identities and the narratives that we've grown up with. What are the stories that we've heard from our families? What are the stories we're hearing in just the world around us? And some of those stories are really serving us, and some of those stories aren't serving us. And so we invite that introspection, if you will, in that first step, to just notice, hey, what are we working with? And then from there, we can define, based on what's going on with us in this moment, where we are right now, what are we willing to work on, right? We actually talk about in life design how there's a step before any of these others can start called accept, right? Because sometimes we're ready to work on something and sometimes we're really not. So are we ready to work on these things that we're noticing? And then if we are, how do we then start defining and scoping things to take action around?
And so defining would be kind of, you're distilling all that you've learned from the empathize step, and you're figuring out what you're defining. Is it defining? It's defining kind of next steps, or defining
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you might note we do a thing called a balance assessment. We look at, hey, what's the role of work? What's the role of relationships in our lives? What's the role of play in our lives? How about our health? And we take stock of those things. We often think about work-life balance, but that's not a very helpful framing, actually. Giving ourselves more levers to pull, more aspects to work with, then gives us a chance to really focus in on areas where we might want to define something to change. And so the invitation is, after you notice, hey, how's it going in work? How satisfied are you? How's it going in love? How satisfied are you? How satisfied are you? How's it going with play? How satisfied are you? How's it going with health? How satisfied are you? You might notice, oh, well, one of these needs a little attention. And so then the invitation is, okay, well, let's define, how might I improve my health in some small way? And then we talk about incremental changes. How can we make one small change? After we've come up with lots of ideas, we might pick one of them to try out. And that trying out in some tiny way, this is not talking about boiling the ocean. This is talking about trying something maybe for a day or a week to notice, does it make a difference? And so that defining is that first pointer. Hey, what do I want to focus on? Where do I want to generate some ideas? And where might I eventually take action?
That's great. And I want to walk through some more of these steps, because this is, I think, really helpful. And we're getting a lot of audience questions. But I want to pause for a second, because we're getting kind of two related questions that I think are really valuable to talk about. So one is, hey, I'm mid-career. Is it too late to start doing this? Or
oh, gosh, no.
I just graduated from high school. Is it too late for me to start doing this? And so could you talk a little bit about, my understanding is this applies at any time, and it's not a thing that you stop doing. Yeah, it's not a thing you just do once. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe if you have some experience with people at different stages, whether it be high school, college students, or professionals, talk a little bit about that and how that's different for them or the same.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I teach students of all ages, from late high school all the way through, almost to the end of life, really. I've taught folks who are 17. I've taught folks who are 85. So everybody is in the same process, as I mentioned, of, hey, what matters to me and how can I live a life where I will thrive? So that's a universal question, I think. And as we go through different phases of life, different things or different constraints might come up. But at the end of the day, we're all asking these same kinds of questions. And this process is age agnostic. At any given time, we can stop, take stock, decide where we want to place our energy or place our focus, come up with lots of ideas, decide to try something, and then test it. If you want to boil it all down, it really boils down to get curious. Talk to people, try things, tell your story, right? We're in this process of iteration and building our way forward, because life keeps changing. So if you're somebody who's in high school, you might not have complete agency, to be perfectly frank. You might still live at home. You might have parents. You might have teachers. You might have constraints around what you can and cannot do, because you are not yet the captain of your own ship. You might not be providing all of the resources towards what you're doing. And those people who are providing the resources may have strong opinions about what you can and cannot do. And so the invitation is to consider where you do have agency. So when I work with young students, I'm talking a lot with them about, hey, what are the constraints that you're working under? And how do we work inside those constraints to generate ideas that work given the things that you value, the relationships that you value, and the things that you're trying to work within? As we get older, we might have a little bit more agency, but at the same time, we might have more responsibility. Now we've got kids and mortgages and all these other things. And so the invitation here is, again, to define what it is that matters to you, to consider, hey, what are the constraints that I can throw off because I've just decided those are fears, or those are other things that are holding me back, or I'm holding myself back, or where are these real systemic constraints? And then how do I ideate within those constraints to create prototypes that I can try to move the ball forward? So it really is a universal process. It doesn't matter, actually, to me, how old you are. What matters is, are you willing to get curious? Is this the right time? Are you ready to try something? And trying something can be free, right? It can be something as small as just talking to someone about a future life that you might want to live. Somebody out there is probably doing the thing that you want to do. Can you have a conversation with them and learn more about it? That doesn't cost you anything, but it might be hard to do, meaning psychologically difficult to make that first ask or to reach out. And you may or may not have the network. So it may take a few steps to get to that person. And sometimes that takes courage and it takes time. So maybe time is the biggest resource that I see being a constraint for many of us. But yeah, universally applicable, I think, Pax.
So not any time in your life, and as you're saying, it's not just we're focused kind of on career today because that's of particular interest to lots of people. It's a very important part of all our lives. Right. But it can apply to lots of things that you're thinking about. How to do better at school. I mean, you said you offer a version of this course for Stanford graduates or undergrads as they're planning their
right.
trajectory. Yeah,
that's right.
So I'm going to repeat the steps again because people they said I want to hear. I want to hear those steps again, and then maybe talk a little bit about the next step, prototyping. So the first step is, again, empathize, right? So empathize with yourself in this case. What is it you really want? So you're kind of figuring out what your values are, what you want out of work, what you want out of life, and then there's defining, is taking that to define what are going to be next steps, and then you generate some ideas for how you might take those next steps, and then prototyping, is that taking that next step? That's
right. So as we define, we're often asking ourselves a question: how might I increase the balance and energy in my life? How might I try out some aspect of, let's say I want to be a book author, of being a book author, right? And then we might generate lots and lots of ideas. And the idea of ideation is about divergence. So one of the things I really like about this process is it invites us to diverge first. Often we're really in this space of trying to converge. I'm trying to get the right answer. We're trained by our education system to converge. But in reality, before we converge, it's nice to really get all the ideas on the table, even the weird ideas and the wild ideas. And so I want to talk a little bit more about ideation before we get to the prototyping step, because ideation is one of those things that we often think we're good at, but it takes a lot of practice to get good. And it really is an invitation to the wild and weird and wacky that will often get us into a space that we hadn't already been in. If we're stuck and we're in the same spaces over and over, we're having the same kinds of ideas, those ideas aren't helping us. And so we need wild and wacky ideas. And so in our classes, we talk a lot about this process of getting good at ideation. How do we break out of what we call schemas, particular trains of thought that are very common and well-trod, in order to get into new spaces that might help us get unstuck? And so we've got lots of tools to do that. People might have heard of brainstorming. We do some verbal brainstorming in our classes, but we also do things like idea boarding or mind mapping, or using a technique called forced morphology to really push our brains into new spaces and to think about other ways to attack the kinds of problems that we're stuck on so that we can potentially get unstuck. So once we've generated all of those ideas, then we pick some to take action on, just like you said, Pax. The idea of prototyping is, what are we going to try? And prototyping is not making a huge leap. Prototyping is, at its very core, about reducing risk, because it's scary to change and it's scary to try new things. So prototyping is about reducing risk because we're going to do something really, really small to see is there a there there. And so we want to do something that is cheap. We want to do something that is accessible to us. It's easy. We don't have a lot of mental blocks against it. I wanted something that's fast because we want to get this data quickly. We don't want to mess around. So we want something that we can do in a relatively short order. So cheap, quick, and easy. That's something to think about when you're thinking about prototyping. And what we're really talking about is if we do something, we learn something. And if we do something, we engage others often in our process. So all of a sudden, we've learned some things about the area we're curious about. We've potentially met some people who are interested in that stuff too. So now we've got some collaborators and folks on our team, and we've learned something about ourselves. Hey, how did that feel when I did that thing? And so prototyping is kind of magic, I think. It's a bias to action, trying things and learning things on the fly, not by thinking about them, but by doing them. And I think you learn more that way for many of us than in any other way.
That's great. And I know something that comes up here, and I think it might actually be out of Stanford. I can't remember where the research is, but it was something like to create 10 products that succeed, you need 600 ideas or something, right? So we totally underestimate the number of ideas you need to generate to actually create something that's successful. So I who knows if that study is replicated? I don't know where it's from, but I know it gets thrown around a lot here, and it's an interesting meme or way of thinking about it. That, as you said, iteration is very important.
It is, and it's also very difficult for people. And prototyping is really scary because we don't want to admit we don't know the answer. We're afraid we're going to fail. We're afraid we're going to have to throw away work, right? All of those things for many of us, especially high achievers, like many of you on this call, are kicking ass and taking names, to put it just in kind of the vernacular, right? You are doing great work out there, and you are used to being a high performer. And if you are used to being a high performer, the idea of trying something new that might not work can be terrifying. And so I really just want to point out, we are going to fail sometimes. We don't know the answer. The future is unknown. And we are going to have to recognize that all of our successes are the summation of many, many small tries at things where we have learned that we're building on. So it is a little scary, but if there was a better way to do it, I would tell you. It's pretty much necessary.
And so I think if it's okay, let's stay on this kind of that you're talking about. Change is scary, right? And I mean, especially right, I want to try a new job, but do I quit my job? Can I afford to quit my job? Right. And we're getting kind of questions around that, like, what if I want to explore a new career, but I can't just leave my current career. Or we've also gotten a couple questions of, I've invested really a lot of time into this particular career, and it's an important part of my conception of myself, but I'm not loving it anymore. So maybe that actually comes back to that empathize step. But could you give us some examples? I mean, you've given some, so it might be talking to someone in that career, but could you give some other examples of what a prototype might be, or some of the prototypes you've seen that aren't that scary, or that are within our reach? Yeah,
absolutely. The prototype conversation is easy and very accessible. It's kind of magical, as I mentioned, because you learn something about the field that you're curious about. You also learn something about yourself. Does that person's story resonate with my story? And it doesn't involve you selling yourself or putting out a huge resume or anything. In fact, if you're trying to have one of these conversations, I recommend you don't send your resume, because it's not about you. You aren't in that moment job interviewing. What you're doing is really trying to get someone else's story and trying to understand, hey, how does that resonate? And what are the problems that they are working on in this space? Are they the problems I thought they were working on? Are those the problems that are interesting to me? And as you start having more and more of these conversations inside of a given domain, what happens is you start understanding the domain. You start having the language of the domain. You start sounding like a domain insider, and suddenly you are actually a much more viable job candidate when and if you decide to job interview. So prototype conversations, huge. I want to just hammer that home as being, sometimes people call them info interviews. These are a power tool, and they work amazingly well. If you are thinking about prototype experiences, though, there are lots of things you can do without quitting your job. Let's say, for example, you're curious about being a book author. Well, write a chapter, write a paragraph, do some small piece of that. Go sit in a coffee shop and write for a while. Where do you like to write if you were curious about writing? Try out a bunch of different locations. If you're thinking about going to work at a new company, go sit in their lobby for half a day. Just do your regular work from their lobby on your laptop. Do you like the vibe of the place? Are the people walking in and out looking happy? Do they talk to each other in the way that you hope you will talk with your colleagues? Do they seem like they're hurried, stressed? Does it seem like they're relaxed? What is the feeling of being in that building? You can learn a lot from something like that. And again, it costs you nothing. You could try working or shadowing someone for a day. You could take on an assignment while someone else is on maternity or paternity leave. You could take on an assignment that is small enough that you can get a taste of some new aspect of a job inside your current job. Maybe I'm interested in moving from engineering to marketing, say. Could I decide to write a marketing blurb about the product that I'm building and just bounce it off someone in marketing in my company? Not because my blurb necessarily would be used, not because I'm going to take over comms altogether, but by just practicing that and getting a little feedback from a colleague, I can learn, do I like doing that? Am I any good at it to start? What skills might I need to build in order to move into that space? And so I think we often think about huge moves. I'm going to go intern for 3 months. I'm going to quit my job and become a bartender in Belize. Well, before I quit my job and become a bartender in Belize, like, why don't I just make a few drinks for friends at a party, right? And see, do I like doing that, taking orders? Can I remember all the ingredients? There's some little thing that you can do to just taste a tiny bit of the future that you want to hold. And so I think prototype conversations and prototype experiences both are accessible to all of us, regardless of resources and regardless of where we are in our careers.
That's fantastic. And it's interesting. And I want to come back. So again, I'm going to say them again, right? So the empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. And so it just one question. So say you prototype something, say you go, I want to be a bartender in Belize, right? Or something. And then you go and you do some drinks. You're like, you know what? I make a terrible mojito. I can't remember drink orders. This isn't for me. Do you then, I mean, can you go back to any stage? Do you go back and go, but I also just didn't like it as much as I thought I would like it. And so do you then go back to the empathize stage, or do you go, how, I know it's not a linear process. You said that at the beginning. Can you just talk about how you might, okay, I've prototyped something.
What next?
And it's not, what next? Yeah.
Yeah, you can go anywhere. So maybe you realize that, hey, this prototype didn't represent the aspect of the thing that I'm actually curious about. I actually don't really care about the bartending part. It's really about living in Belize, right? The noticing of, hey, why didn't I like that can give me some more data. I really like the interacting with people and being able to serve them drinks. I didn't like the remembering of the drinks. Is there some other way that I could serve and interact with people more? Maybe my job currently is very solo. And so what I'm really realizing is the thing I'm looking for is more human interaction, or I'm looking for a different location, or I'm looking for, so it starts giving you more data. And then you have a couple options. Maybe that means you're going back to empathize with yourself. Maybe I need to learn some more things about me, right? Or maybe it's a situation where, hey, I didn't define what I'm looking for very accurately. So maybe you drop back to there. Or maybe you realize, I just need some better ideas about how to prototype this thing. The serving drinks at a party, there wasn't any money exchange. Like, there wasn't anything, the idea of running a business, the bartending part, it didn't get at that bit. And that bit is going to be really important for me to understand more about this potential future, right? So I want to come up with another idea to prototype this further. Or maybe it is just a recognition that, hey, I'm not working on the thing that I thought I wanted to work on.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's really that's interesting. Just again, thinking it's not a thing you do once, right? It's not a thing you sit down, you spend 2 weeks, you're done. It's a constant process. It's something that you're essentially integrating into your life. That you're integrating. It's a process, continually approaching and thinking about it. I think and I believe in the class that you offer on campus that you do a thing called Odyssey planning. Is that right?
Yes,
could you tell us a little bit about Odyssey planning and what that is and how that relates to this whole process?
Yeah, absolutely. So after we've done a bunch of small prototypes, one of the things we might invite people to do is take a look at potential futures for themselves. For our students who are just graduating, they've never had jobs in some cases, right? If they have had, they typically have been part-time jobs. We do have some students who've taken gap years and they've gone off and had full-time jobs for some period of time, but many of our students haven't even worked yet. When I think about folks who are out there who are mid-career professionals or folks in later parts of their career, they might also be asking the same question, what next? What do I want to do next? And our temptation is to think, I got to figure out the best option. I've got to figure it out and then execute. But the hard part about that is by forcing ourselves into a singular plan, all of a sudden there's a lot of pressure. So what Odysseys are Odysseys are three very different visions of your next 5 years. We invite people to create a timeline for each of those versions of their future self. We invite them to look at major personal and professional milestones, one in each year at least. If you've been thinking a lot about that work, love, health, play assessment, we might even invite, think about what are you going to be doing for work in each of those years? What are you going to be doing to build relationships in each of those years? And by relationships, by the way, I don't mean romantic relationships solely. I mean relationships of all kinds. Who are the people that you care about and that care about you? Maybe even pets or other aspects of relationship in your life. What are you going to be doing for play in each of those 5 years? How are you taking care of your health in each of those 5 years? And each of these lives should be radically different from the other. Not because necessarily you already have 3 random ideas for your future, but by forcing yourself to think about, hey, what if the life I was leading right now played out in the best possible way? What if I couldn't do what I'm doing right now? Not because I'm not awesome, but because this industry goes away, right? We've been seeing in a lot of places in the world shifts in what's available in terms of work, just because things are changing. Computer science is suddenly a thing that wasn't even existent 30 years ago. There are all these different opportunities that are changing and growing as the conditions around us change. So the idea that we aren't doing what we're currently doing, but we still have all of our wonderful skills that we have picked up over time that we could apply to a new thing is an interesting one to ponder. So how would I apply my skills to something else if I wasn't doing what I'm doing currently? And then we invite people to think about the wild card life. This is the bartender and Belize thing for some of us, right? What would I do if I had no constraints? If I had all the money I needed, if no one would laugh at me, if societal constraints were released, if gender-based constraints were released, if I could throw off as many constraints as I can and think super wildly, what would I do? So those 3 framings are sometimes helpful as we think about these 5-year futures. And then we play them out, so on paper, and then we look at them, we notice, how do I feel about them? Because in some ways, these are both ideas and tiny prototypes. Right? We get the ideas out there. We think of these really divergent futures. And then we take a moment to take stock. How does that strike me? What would I call this life? We have people title the life. 5 words or less. Just a quick title. You know, Kathy bartends in Belize. Right? And Kathy takes over higher ed. Kathy heads back to industry. Right? Those might be my 3 titles. And then I look at, well, do I like it? Do I have the resources to do it? Am I confident I could pull it off? And then because we've done a bunch of empathy work, we notice, is this coherent with what I said I wanted in a work? What I said my life view was? What I noticed in terms of my balance assessment? What I noticed in terms of flow? All of the other tools and activities that we've done in our class. So we get a sense of, does this fit who I am and who I want to become? And that invitation is doubled down upon by sharing them verbally with our peers. So then we get into a group of 3 people, and each person shares out loud those 3 visions of their future. And what's fascinating is you can see it in people's body and in their voice where they're excited, right? You have the person who's like, well, I guess what I would do. Right? As soon as you hear that in their voice, you know, this isn't maybe their story. This is the story that somebody else told them they should do, or this is a story that they feel trapped in, or this is a story they aren't that excited about. But on the other hand, if you hear somebody talking about, okay, so then I'm going to set up a hub of the Life Design Lab in Australia, and we are going to have an exchange program with Australian educators and art. Right, all of a sudden, you can see in my voice and in my body language, I'm stoked about the idea of setting up a hub in Australia. I want to do that. And so our peers can reflect back to us where we're energized, where it sounds like a story that our heart is in. And then that's new data. And once we've got these all laid out, right, now it's like, okay, well, if I wanted one of these things, where would I start? What little tiny prototype could I run to test? Because I'm super excited about starting a hub in Australia. How could I do that? How could I start testing that? Could I make a connection with one Australian educator and build one piece of curriculum together? Would that be fun as I think it's going to be, as meaningful as I think it would be? And if it is, then I can keep going in that direction. And if it's not, I can go back to those odysseys. I can make a 4th, a 5th. I can combine them together, but I can start noticing, hey, where are their themes? Where are their threads that I want to take action around? Not huge action, not quit my job and move to Belize action, just trying it out action, because I'm going to sneak up on it and learn as I go.
That's fantastic, and I love the observation that you're sitting there reading these you clearly spent a long time reading these life paths that you planned, and then you're just not excited about some. And so I was just thinking, I mean, that for some people that might lead you back to the empathize, is you're like, I thought this was consistent with my values and what I wanted out of work, but clearly it's not. And so now I need to do some more reflecting. Yeah. This
and
is
we call them plans, but they're not plans. Like, you know, it's a funny thing in the book Designing Your Life, Bill and Dave titled these Odyssey plans, and I actually more and more just call them Odysseys, or even just ideas, because at the end of the day, you probably aren't going to write down a 5-year plan and then execute it to the letter over 5 years. In fact, I asked my students at one point, if you could write this all down and then you'd be locked in, you're forced to execute it over the next 5 years, exactly as you've written it today, how many of you would want that? And you know, there were a handful of people who put up their hand, and then a bunch of other people said no. And I asked one of the women who had said no, she didn't want that, why not? And she said this brilliant thing. She said, because I sure hope the me of tomorrow is smarter than the me of today. And I loved that, because what that really is acknowledging that we are always getting smarter. We're always growing and changing. And in fact, it would be foolish to lock ourselves in based on what we know today, because we're going to get more data. We are going to gain new skills. We're going to realize new strengths. And so to give ourselves the flexibility to constantly be prototyping and growing and changing in many ways is a much more powerful position to be in than somehow lockstep with a plan that I developed maybe when I didn't have all the data that I currently have.
That is fantastic. Yes. And that in itself is a really important lesson to learn. I know sometimes when especially I'm sure this is true for undergraduates, they're like, I'm going to graduate and then I'm going to be in my career and that's it for the rest of my life.
Right.
And it's like, no.
And that's the only career I'm going to have, which is ridiculous. In fact, the data that most of our graduates right now are changing jobs every 2 to 3 years. They are slated to have 15 to 20 jobs over the course of their lifetime, and 2 to 3 fully separate careers. Fully separate. Think about that. That means they're going to do things that are completely different. And maybe there are going to be careers that they will have that currently do not exist, that they will build and create as the world changes. So this idea that the decision you make today is forever, that you're locked into it, it's just not true. It's just not true. Maybe that was the case in, you know, my parents' and grandparents' lives, that people tended to be in one job and stay in one town and you know, retire there. But that's not the reality that our students are living in. And for many of us, that's not the reality we are living in, regardless of age, because things are shifting around us with or without our consent.
This is fantastic, and we're reaching the end of time, and we are getting a lot of questions about resources. So I want to repeat that there are some links. There are some links in your console that can take you to the Life Design Lab, and I believe, Kathy, you've got more resources that are linked out there if people are interested.
I do.
There is a book about this as well. And then maybe can you say, so there is this course that's happening. There is a course that is happening on campus. What's remote, it's online this next spring quarter. It's called Designing the Professional. Can you tell us a little bit more about that course and what's involved in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're offering the class Designing the Professional in the spring virtually. It's a 10-week course. We'll be meeting online for 2 hours a week, plus some bonus sessions, extra hour, probably 5 or 6 over the course of the quarter. So about 30 hours of material in person or in conversation with others. And then we've got a bunch of assignments, of course, in between all of that will support people in going through this process. So it starts with empathy, really. It's really this process of noticing, hey, what is my lived experience? Who am I? What are my views on work? What are my views on life? Really digging into things like balance and energy, digging into what helps people thrive, thinking about how can we leverage some key tools in exploring potential careers? How might we, in fact, look at our existing career experience and notice things like, how much change do I like in my environment? Where do I like to have impact? How can I learn from my past experiences to guide me? in potentially having some prototype conversations and experiences around my next step in my career. We spend a bunch of time thinking about decision making. How do I make choices? How do I weigh options? What are the tools I could use if I've got some opportunities? What are the tools I can use to develop opportunities? How can I come up with ideas for opportunities for myself? How can I create connections with others? How can I ask for what I want at work? I mean, for those of you who are having jobs out there, one of the things you might be thinking about is, my boss would never let me. And in fact, sometimes the boss would, if you can really frame things appropriately, how your professional growth and the goals of your group or of your company could overlap in a really powerful way. That would then allow them to retain you. Frankly, right now we've got the Great Recession going on. Many a company is interested in keeping their wonderful people. And so how could you make that ask? So we're going to be talking about that in the course. We're going to be talking about creating these odysseys for yourself. How can you start prototyping into those odysseys? So it's a whole journey, really, of figuring out how could we start becoming the person that we want to become. We're not just going to talk about career. We're going to also talk about how does career fit in with the rest of your life? Because let's be honest, we've got careers, they take up a lot of our time and energy, but there's also all those other things that make life worth living. What about family? What about the things we do for fun? What about our own spiritual beliefs? What about our own views of why we're here on this planet? How does that all fit together in a way that creates a life of meaning and purpose? So that's the overview of the course, 20 to 30 hours of time spent together doing this work, and then a bunch of work on your own doing some reflection. I want to say one thing about the community part, because it's really important. And Pax mentioned the book. You can absolutely just go and buy the Designing Your Life book and work through all the exercises by yourself. There's a workbook online too. I think Amazon sells it for $15. And I recommend doing that because it's really good stuff. But even more, I recommend finding some other people to have these conversations, because like we were discussing before, when you speak things into the world, and in our classes, we ask people to do this a lot. There's a ton of work in small groups, in pairs, in groups of 3, where we're practicing these things. We're practicing the ask. We're reading our work view aloud. We're reading our worldview aloud. We're sharing our Odyssey plans aloud, and we're hearing one another's. And so then you get ideas from folks who have different perspectives and ideas than you. Then you can steal those ideas. Designers are all about radical collaboration and sharing ideas. So you get more ideas, you get potentially ideas to get unstuck. And then you also get this feeling of not being alone, because we're all in this process together. It is not that, oh my gosh, I haven't figured it out yet. There's something wrong with me. None of us have it figured out. We're all working on this as an iterative process. And so being in community around these questions is magical. And people can reflect back things to you that you can't see yourself, either because you're too close to it, or because as you say it out loud, your body and your voice tells you new data. So there's something about the community bit that for me is critical to life design. This idea of having a life design team, of working with others, is perhaps more powerful than anything else when it comes right down to it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, always having. You had also mentioned just reading it creates a level of commitment. It creates a level of accountability for a lot of this.
Ownership. Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're at time, and you went over. So thank you so much for
staying. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. I don't have any objection. I don't think the audience has any objection. We are getting lots of questions about future offerings. So there's this one course that we mentioned being offered this spring. Is a graduate level course. It is a Stanford 4-credit course. So if you were to take it through Stanford Online, you would be taking it as a non-degree student. You would get a Stanford transcript. But I know that you have a lot of other resources that are out there, and we're getting questions, I think, even from people at Stanford about, what are the future offerings. Is the Life Design Lab, is that the best place for them to go to see what offerings are out there and what might be happening in the future?
It's a great place to go. It's a great place to go. The book website is also available. So that's designingyou.life. So Bill and Dave have a website about the books themselves, and so you could check for resources there. But really, the Life Design Lab at Stanford is the place to go as you're thinking about offerings at Stanford. And there you'll see some other recorded talks. You'll also see some links to the classes on campus. There are potentially events that we do on campus, so workshops that we do for particular groups on campus. So check them out. I absolutely welcome any of you in the course that we're going to be doing. The course will be graduate students and you if you decide to join it. And what I love about that is that graduate students are in a very particular part of their career path. They've potentially specialized to an incredible degree, and they're thinking about how can I use that specialization out there in the world in some way. And you might be someone out there in the world who's curious about next steps, and talking to these specialists about their experience might give you new ideas. And so there's this beautiful radical collaboration that I think will happen in this spring class. I'm very excited about it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. I think that's it. And we appreciate your time. We appreciate all of you joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.